The writings are like the kitchen sink of the Old Testament. This is the collection of writings that don't fit neatly into the first two groups, Torah or law and prophets. So they're just called writings. In the Jewish Bible, they come last, after the law and the prophets. So you see them in the lower left. The writings are Israel's worship, the Psalter, and its illuminating contemplation of the God that it was coming to know more maturely as the years went on. So we're going to use them to discuss the illuminative way. In the Jewish Bible, the writings include the Psalms, the Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ruth and Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra and Nehemiah, and Chronicles. The Greek Old Testament, called the Septuagint, and the Christian Old Testament, which tends to follow it, move some of these writings into the former prophets and the latter prophets. We'll focus on Psalms and especially on the wisdom literature. Psalms, or the Psalter, is Israel's hymnal. It's its prayer book for worship. I mentioned that rules reflect relationships. Well, worship obviously reflects relationships of adoration, contrasting with the folly of idolatry, false gods. Worship expresses those relationships, and it further builds and strengthens those relationships. So we're also looking at the unitive way, I think especially in the case of the Psalter. God initiated this relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and saw it through in Egypt and in the wilderness and into the Promised Land. So the unitive way is finally in the Psalter adequately acknowledged and enjoyed and celebrated. And the Psalter, as the official hymn book of Israel, trains its worshipers in faith or trust, in hope, especially in difficult circumstances, and in love, especially love for fellow Israelites and for the Lord of all of them, in both good and bad circumstances. If the Psalms are Israel's hymnal, its wisdom literature is its coach, training it in judgment, the way a good coach trains an athlete, not just to be stronger, but to be wiser. An athlete needs excellent judgment, and the wisdom literature trains Israel in better judgment. If the priests are in charge of Israel's worship, wisdom belongs to Israel's sages, its wise people, who embody its wisdom and who pass it on to disciples. And the fruit of their contemplations is extraordinarily diverse. This collection has everything. It honors the intensity of real life, the complicated structures of real life, their complexity, and their unpredictability. This collection does not just represent the same formula over and over. Do this and you will get that result. Life is too complicated for that. You don't know whether you're living in Proverbs, where your good deeds will earn good results, or whether you're living in Job, where your good deeds are going to get you attention and suffering, or whether you're in Ecclesiastes, where your good deeds really aren't going to amount to much in the long run. You have to have judgment to know when these writings apply, in which circumstances. So the wisdom literature, also like the Psalter, builds the relationships with God that we have into relationships of sonship or inheritance. The classic trope in the book of Proverbs is a father training, raising his son to be his heir, and the son will need the judgment and the character to inherit what the father has for him. This contrasts with the fool, who gets disinherited because it's irresponsible to leave things to him. We're talking about the purgative way too, aren't we? Raising an heir means growing that young person out of the habits that don't belong if he or she is to inherit. So there's a purgation involved of what doesn't fit. The purgative way is fitting in here as well as the unitive way. I'm going to highlight the illuminative way because wisdom and illumination so naturally go together, but without neglecting the fact that all these ways happen at the same time, they have the same goal, and they depend on each other. Also, it's not clear that purgation automatically follows illumination. We tend to learn the hard way. Sometimes it takes the ruin of our lives to open our eyes. That was true of the prodigal son. Well, the complexity of the collection of wisdom literature demonstrates that Proverbs is not enough for raising a good and worthy son. Sometimes it takes the school of hard knocks. That was certainly true in Israel's experience, which is why we will be associating the purgative way with the prophets, which is why there's wisdom in the Jewish Bibles ordering things the way they do, with the prophets coming next. And after we've paid our tuition in the school of hard knocks, we're finally humble and ready to accept the illumination that the writings offer. This literature has a feature that can throw some readers. It tends to reduce humanity into two extreme types, light and darkness, wise and fool. Of course, life's more complicated, we're more complicated. I have some of each in me. I'd rather not discuss which proportion. But by comparing myself to those two types in each of these books, I can get a sense of the proportion and how to improve it. But each book in this collection of wisdom literature tends to draw a different distinction between the two extreme types. And that might remind you of the four great truths that Peter Kraft identified in the whole world of different proposals of what's wrong, what's right, and how to get right. Each of these writings has a way of portraying the goal, the telos, or the end of life. Each one shows us a picture of the good life, a picture of trial and tribulation that tempts us to go the dark way, and a picture of the bad life. The goal in life that's most visible in Proverbs is that of flourishing. The good life consists of righteousness. The source of our trials is our own passions, our impulses, and the temptations from both inside and outside us. And if we fall for those temptations, our end is wickedness and ruin. Ecclesiastes has a very different picture of things. Vanity, pointlessness, everything is pointless. That's actually a dysteleological vision. That's a picture of life as lacking a goal, or at least the goal being so modest that even if it's worth pursuing, it's relatively trivial. The good life then looks pretty modest in Ecclesiastes. It's a life of contentment. Enjoy life with your wife all your meaningless days under the sun, Ecclesiastes says. Well, that's something. And contemplation and the illumination that comes from it is of some value. The teacher has seen a lot, looked around a lot, and arrived at these conclusions, and knowing them can leave you a little better off than the fool, even though you're both going to end up in the same graveyard. The evils of Ecclesiastes, the trials, are toil, our work. They're the fact that observation leads to these kind of depressing realizations. The marginally worse bad life looks like a life of heedlessness, either in ignorance of the real nature of things, the basically meaningless shape of things, or just opposition to it, trying to fight a losing battle against a meaningless world. Job illuminates a whole different side of life. You can be righteous. In fact, you can be the most righteous and end up suffering the most of all. You will not learn that lesson in Proverbs, and a father is not going to teach either Ecclesiastes or Job to children who need to learn as they grow up to strive to do well. Ecclesiastes and Job are for when you've tried and the results have disappointed you. In Job, life comes down to suffering, or at least it involves suffering at such a basic level that it's inescapable. You can call that life's essence, although you can't really call it its goal. In that sense, this is a dysteleological vision too. However, the end of Job, especially after the beginning of Job, vindicates the character of Job. And we see that the goal of life is actually the glory of the righteous God who vindicates and restores his righteous, good servant, and the vindication and the glory of that restored servant. Job embodies the good life of faithfulness and worship, since he emerges at the other side of his sufferings having seen God and having had his questions at least honored. The trials in Job are the afflictions themselves and the friends, Job's friends, and their misplaced theology. Job never surrenders to those temptations. He retains his integrity, which means lack of integrity is the bad life. Just curse God and die, his wife says. Job knows that he's not suffering justly, so he refuses to do that. He refuses to lead the bad life that actually his friends embody in their presumption that their formulas of life are accurate. In the context of wisdom literature, you could say that Job's friends embody the bad life of bad judgment, and wisdom is all about training in good judgment. Song of Songs, again, a very different picture. The goal of life is clearly love. The good life is love's desire, especially when it's fulfilled in unity and the consummation of that relationship. The temptations of life are distance and misunderstanding. And the bad life is for these lovers to be kept apart in isolation or separation. Also, indifference is the bad life of Song of Songs, one who hasn't loved at all. The telos of the Psalms is worship, the good life of adoration of the Lord who has related himself to us. Temptations are the pressures that life's trials and tribulations put on us. Those are temptations to give up on this relationship, and so many do when trial comes their way. They resign themselves to rejecting the Lord or rejecting at least a relationship with him. That's the bad life of the Psalms. The psalmist doesn't go there, at least not for long. Memories of God's earlier faithfulness, reflections on God's revealed good character almost always bring the psalmist back from the brink and into assurance that this relationship is going to be good again. Daniel is grouped with the prophets in the Greek Old Testament and in the Christian Old Testament. But here, in the Hebrew and Aramaic writings of Israel, his story demonstrates the telos of life as justice, as righteousness, the righteousness of God in vindicating his righteous servants. So justice is the good life, and in the evil world of Babylon, of idolatry, a life that aligns with that good life is going to need perseverance. Daniel and his companions are going to need to stay faithful under the pressure of persecution and the pressure of idolatry of its surrounding culture. Surrendering to the pressure of persecution looks like the bad life of Daniel, and that is immorality, idolatry, and apostasy, turning away from the good life of relationship with God and the justice that it represents. Living the good life, in whatever book we're looking at, brings the blessings of that good life on the one type, the wise one, as well as those around that wise one, their family, their country, their nation. Whereas living the bad life brings ruin and death, not just for the fool, but for the group of the fool, for that fool's family or neighborhood or city or people. And life's trials can move us and do move us in one direction or the other. So the stakes are high. The future of Israel depends on this literature working. Not surprisingly, something this complicated and unwieldy has a number of problems and aporias, unanswered questions that it begs. The first one is practical. Can the sheer momentum of foolishness really be overcome by contemplation and advice? We don't live in a world that looks like wisdom just bowls folly over. It looks more often like folly wins, at least often enough to discourage the wise and to empower the fools to think this really works. A second question it begs, especially because of its device of putting everyone in one group or another. Can anyone really measure up? Since we're all somewhere in between sage and fool, true worshiper and idolater, does anyone meet the proper standard for a truly wise, flourishing person, let alone a truly wise, flourishing society? Another question is how to relate these various and really different strands of wisdom. What do we do with the whole picture? A lovely book that in some ways I'm just expanding on here is Peter Kreeft's book, 3 Philosophies of Life. Ecclesiastes, and then Job, and then Song of Songs give Kreeft a kind of map that he says takes us through hell, through purgatory, to heaven, especially as Song of Songs symbolically represents our life with God, as well as a guide that trains us in faith, and Ecclesiastes is like the mirror image or the negative of faith. Hope, which is something that Job learns and readers learn through his example, and love, of course, in Song of Songs. That sequence also suggests to him frustration with life, the humiliation that life delivers us, and exaltation if we remain faithful. The wisdom literature begs the question of which visions and which ethics do these various strands of wisdom convey or lend themselves to, and how do our visions of goodness and ethics navigate the variety of visions here? I'll just leave this up long enough for you to pause and take a look if you want. I'm not going to go through them all. I think it's possible to draw rough correlations between each of the writings that we're examining here and the various kindred schools of ethics, the ones that lend themselves most naturally to that text, as well as which way or spiritual path is most clearly served by that writing. I find just about every school of thought that we've looked at, every vision that we've looked at, resonates with one or more of the wisdom writings, as well as Psalms and Daniel, which does suggest a bigger picture in Israel's canon, and especially where Israel's canon is going. A final problem is whether all of this wise nurture, all of this wisdom will save Israel, God's whole people Israel, or whether it'll just rescue a few exemplars, a few sages who manage to follow its paths of wisdom. It does seem to be saving a remnant. There is a remnant of faithfulness, hopefulness, and love all through Israel's history. Paul draws attention to it in Romans 9 through 11, but it's not enough. God's promises to Abraham sound like more than a faithful remnant, and Paul is pursuing that theme in Romans 9 to 11 to the conclusion in Romans 11 that it won't just be a remnant of Israel. But can all of this nurture deliver that? More of Israel will be saved than what's possible with just this literature, and that begs the question of how. Paul is finding clarity for these kinds of problems in Israel's story, in the way that God's purposes are unfolding and coming to fulfillment through the development of Israel, Well, that's narrative ethics. And narrative ethics is going to say that these problems are resolved within the broader saga of the kingdom. But there's a wrinkle here, a really important wrinkle. Wisdom literature appeals to creation's deeper metaphysical structure for wisdom. Wisdom in Proverbs 8 is reflected in the deep structure of all creation. The story of creation might not be the most natural expression of that wisdom. It might be in metaphysics that we see wisdom glimmering through. So narrative ethics might not win the battle for which is the best paradigm from which to view this wisdom, this illumination. And that leads to a question, really a dilemma. Should a truly biblical ethical perspective look beyond a narrative framework to something like principles or eternal truths? Or is there no final framework in which all of these pieces fit together? Maybe life is just hopelessly complicated and convoluted, and these different glimpses, these different ways of seeing the way things are, don't finally add up to a coherent picture.